The moment I looked down at my phone and realized the date, something inside me quietly broke. It was my birthday. The morning sun poured through my apartment window, painting everything in warm golden light, yet my screen remained painfully silent. No message. No missed call. No surprise. The one person I had waited to hear from all morning was the one person who seemed to have forgotten I even existed. As the hours slipped away, the excitement I had carried for weeks slowly turned into disappointment, then confusion, and finally into a sadness I couldn't explain. If you've ever believed in kindness, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways love can be tested, I hope you'll stay with this story. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this one, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone special, and subscribing to Tales Maybe for more stories that remind us how powerful compassion can be. My name is Maren, and birthdays had never been about expensive presents or elaborate celebrations. Growing up, my parents made every birthday feel magical even when money was tight. My mother baked simple homemade cakes. My father filled the living room with colorful balloons from the dollar store. And together they convinced me that love was measured in effort rather than price. Those memories stayed with me long after I moved into my own apartment and began building a life as a graphic designer in the heart of a busy city. 2 years earlier, I had met Rowan during a neighborhood charity event. He wasn't loud or charming in the way movies often portrayed romance. Instead, he had a quiet kindness that drew people toward him. He remembered little details about everyone he met. He helped elderly neighbors carry groceries without being asked. He volunteered on weekends even after exhausting workdays. Falling in love with him felt as natural as watching sunrise replace darkness. During our relationship, he never forgot important moments. He remembered the anniversary of our first coffee together. He remembered the day I adopted my rescue dog. He even remembered the date of my first art exhibition, surprising me afterward with flowers and my favorite pastries. Remembering people mattered to him. That was why the silence on my birthday felt impossible to understand. I kept checking my phone while pretending to work from home. Every notification made my heart race, before sinking again when it turned out to be another promotional email or a cheerful message from friends and family. My coworkers sent colorful greetings. My younger cousin mailed me a funny video. My parents called before breakfast and sang the birthday song exactly as they had every year since childhood, but Rowan said nothing. I told myself he was probably planning something. Perhaps he wanted to surprise me after work. Perhaps he had hidden his plans carefully. Every hour I invented another excuse to protect my heart. By lunchtime, uncertainty had become impossible to ignore. I opened our message history. The last thing he had sent the previous evening was a simple reminder for me not to skip dinner because I had been working late. It was caring, thoughtful, completely normal. Nothing suggested he had forgotten today. I typed a message asking whether everything was all right. Then I erased it. If he really had forgotten, reminding him felt even more painful. The afternoon dragged on. Outside, children laughed in the nearby park while families enjoyed the bright weather. Cafes filled with people celebrating birthdays, graduations, and ordinary moments that suddenly seemed extraordinary. I watched the world through my apartment window and wondered why my own happiness felt so distant. Around 4 o'clock, I decided not to spend the evening waiting. I bought myself a small bouquet of white daisies from the florist around the corner. They were my favorite flowers, because my grandmother used to say they symbolized hope growing in unexpected places. I carried them home along with a tiny chocolate cake that was just large enough for one person. As I unlocked my apartment, I noticed something strange. A small handwritten envelope rested beneath my door. My heartbeat quickened. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only one sentence. "I'm so sorry." There was no signature, no explanation. Just those 3 words. The handwriting looked like Rowan's, but something about it felt rushed and uneven. I immediately called him. His phone went straight to voicemail. For the first time all day, worry replaced disappointment. Rowan never ignored my calls. I contacted 2 of our mutual friends. Neither had seen him since the previous afternoon. One mentioned that he had left work unexpectedly that morning, after receiving an urgent phone call. My imagination filled every silence with frightening possibilities. Was he hurt? Was someone in his family sick? Had something happened that he couldn't explain? As evening approached, my birthday no longer mattered. I simply wanted to know he was safe. Unable to sit still, I drove toward his apartment. The streets glowed beneath the soft, afternoon sunlight that slowly faded into early evening. Everything looked beautifully ordinary, making my growing anxiety feel strangely out of place. When I arrived, his apartment was empty. His neighbor recognized me and stepped outside. She looked tired. "He hasn't been home," she quietly said. "He left very early carrying a backpack." He looked worried. Worried about what? She gently shook her head. "I don't know." The drive back home felt longer than usual. Every traffic light seemed to hold me still with my thoughts. My mind replayed every conversation we'd had during the previous week, searching desperately for clues I might have missed. Had he seemed distracted? Yes. Had he been sleeping less? Probably. Had I assumed it was simply work stress? Absolutely. When I reached my apartment building, I noticed my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Elowen, watering flowers outside. She smiled kindly before studying my face. "My dear, birthdays shouldn't look like that." I couldn't stop the tears anymore. She invited me inside for tea. Sometimes wisdom arrives in the quietest voices. Mrs. Elowen listened without interrupting. She didn't criticize Rowan or tell me to assume the worst. Instead, she gently reminded me that people often carry invisible burdens. "We only see the chapter they're willing to show us," she said. "Sometimes love means waiting until the whole story is revealed." Her words stayed with me long after I returned home. That night I couldn't sleep. At sunrise the following morning, my phone finally rang. It was an unfamiliar number. For a moment I almost ignored it. Instead I answered. A calm voice introduced herself as a hospital social worker. My heart immediately froze. She asked if I knew Rowan. I whispered yes. She explained that he wasn't injured, but he had listed my name as an emergency contact several months earlier. He was currently at the hospital after spending the entire night there with someone very important to him. She couldn't share many details for privacy reasons, but she said there was one thing she believed I deserved to know.
"He has been talking about you constantly," she said gently.
He kept apologizing because he knew what day yesterday was. Every emotion inside me collided at once. Confusion, relief, hope, fear. I hurried to the hospital without stopping for breakfast, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. The bright morning sky seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the storm. Inside my chest, when I finally reached the reception desk, the nurse quietly directed me toward a family waiting room. As I walked down the hallway, I saw Rowan sitting alone near the window. His clothes were wrinkled. Rowan slowly stood from the chair as I walked toward him, and before either of us could find the right words, the distance between us disappeared in a quiet embrace that carried more emotion than any apology ever could. I could feel how exhausted he was. His shoulders trembled ever so slightly, and his heartbeat raced as though he had been carrying the weight of the world alone. The cheerful, dependable man I knew looked completely drained, and for the first time since my birthday began, I realized that whatever had happened had been far greater than a forgotten date on a calendar. His eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, and the gentle smile he tried to offer only made my heart ache more. He quietly explained that 2 days earlier he had received a phone call from the hospital informing him that the woman who had raised him after his parents passed away had suddenly collapsed. His Aunt Celestine had been more than family. She had sacrificed everything to give him a stable home when he was only 11 years old. She worked multiple jobs, skipped vacations, and quietly gave up countless dreams so Rowan could finish school without worrying about money. She never complained. She simply loved him with every ounce of her strength. When the hospital called, doctors feared she might not survive emergency surgery. Rowan rushed there immediately, believing he would only be gone for a few hours before returning to prepare for my birthday. Instead, one complication after another kept unfolding. She required another operation, then intensive monitoring, and Rowan never left her side. He barely ate, barely slept, and barely remembered what day it was until late the following afternoon. The realization hit him like a wave, and by then every flower shop had already closed. His phone battery had died after endless calls with doctors and relatives, and he felt overwhelmed by guilt. He told me he borrowed a nurse's pen and quickly wrote the apology that had somehow made its way beneath my apartment door. A family friend who lived near my neighborhood happened to be leaving the hospital, and Rowan begged him to deliver the note because he couldn't bring himself to leave his aunt even for an hour. He knew the note would never explain enough, but it was all he could manage in that heartbreaking moment. Listening to him, I felt every assumption I had made over the previous 24 hours quietly dissolve. I remembered every terrible conclusion I had reached while sitting alone with my birthday cake. I remembered convincing myself that perhaps our relationship had changed, that perhaps I wasn't important anymore, yet the truth standing before me was far different. The man I loved had been living through one of the most terrifying nights of his life while desperately wishing he could be beside me. Rowan lowered his head and admitted something that surprised me even more. Months earlier, he had already planned my birthday. He had reserved a quiet table at the little botanical cafe where we had celebrated our first anniversary. He had secretly ordered a custom necklace featuring a tiny pressed daisy inside a crystal pendant because he remembered how much my grandmother loved daisies. He had even taken vacation time from work so we could spend the entire day together exploring the gardens outside the city. Everything had been carefully planned long before the emergency changed everything. He reached into his backpack and carefully removed a small velvet box that had remained untouched through all the chaos. Inside rested the delicate necklace exactly as he had described it. It wasn't expensive, but every detail reflected memories we had created together. Looking at it, I wasn't thinking about jewelry at all. I was thinking about the love behind it. Even while carrying enormous worry for someone who had given him everything, he had still thought about making my birthday meaningful. Just then, one of the nurses entered the waiting room with a warm smile. She recognized me immediately and quietly shared something Rowan had never intended for me to hear. Throughout the long night, whenever doctors left the room, Rowan kept checking the time and whispering that he hoped I wasn't feeling forgotten. He blamed himself over and over, even though everyone around him assured him that no reasonable person would expect him to leave the hospital during such a crisis. The nurse smiled gently and said she had rarely seen someone so torn between two people they loved deeply. Those words settled heavily in my heart. I realized love is not measured by perfect timing or flawless moments. Sometimes it is measured by impossible choices, by showing up where you are needed most even when it costs you something precious. Rowan had not chosen to forget me. He had chosen to stay beside the woman who once stayed beside him when he had no one else. A few hours later, the surgeon came into the waiting area with encouraging news. Aunt Celestine had made it safely through another critical stage. Her condition was still serious, but the doctors were finally optimistic. The relief that washed across Rowan's face was something I will never forget. Tears filled his eyes as he quietly thanked every member of the medical staff who had cared for her. Watching him, I saw the same compassionate man I had fallen in love with 2 years earlier. If anything, I admired him even more. Later that afternoon, I was finally allowed to meet Aunt Celestine. Though weak, she greeted me with a gentle smile that immediately reminded me of Rowan. She apologized repeatedly for ruining my birthday, but I assured her she had done nothing wrong. As we spoke, she shared childhood stories about Rowan that made me laugh through my tears. She described the little boy who once saved his lunch money for weeks, just to buy her flowers after she had worked overtime. She remembered him staying awake beside her bed whenever she became sick, insisting that heroes deserve someone to watch over them too. In that moment, everything made sense. The kindness Rowan showed everyone around him hadn't appeared by accident. It had been planted years earlier by a woman who quietly taught him that love meant sacrifice without expecting recognition. I looked at Aunt Celestine and silently thanked her for raising the man who had become such an important part of my life. The following week brought slow but steady improvements. Every afternoon after work, Rowan and I visited the hospital together. We brought fresh flowers, homemade soup, and photographs that reminded Aunt Celestine of happier days ahead. Nurses often smiled when they saw us because the room that had once been filled with uncertainty gradually became filled with laughter. When she was finally discharged, Rowan surprised me one bright Saturday morning by asking me to dress casually without telling me where we were going. We drove along a winding country road until we reached a peaceful botanical garden bursting with colorful summer flowers. It was the exact place he had planned for my birthday before everything changed. Near the center of the garden stood a small wooden table decorated with white daisies, handwritten notes, and a homemade cake that looked slightly uneven around the edges. Rowan admitted he had baked it himself after watching several online tutorials because he wanted to recreate the simple cakes my parents used to make when I was little. It wasn't perfect. One side leaned slightly and the icing wasn't smooth, but to me it was the most beautiful cake I had ever seen. There were no expensive decorations, no luxury gifts, just sunshine filtering through the trees, birds singing overhead, and the quiet knowledge that we had both learned something important. We laughed about how the celebration had arrived a week late, but somehow it felt exactly right. Some moments don't belong to the calendar. They belong to the people who refuse to let love be forgotten. That afternoon, Rowan handed me a handwritten letter instead of a birthday card. He wrote that life would always bring unexpected storms, missed plans, delayed celebrations, and difficult choices, but he promised that he would never stop choosing honesty, kindness, and the people he loved. He hoped that whenever circumstances disappointed us, we would remember to search for the truth before believing the worst. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same keepsake box where I still keep childhood birthday cards from my parents. It belonged there because it reminded me of the same lesson they had taught me growing up. Real love isn't perfect. It simply keeps showing up even when life makes it incredibly difficult. Months later, whenever someone asked about the birthday my boyfriend forgot, I smiled instead of feeling sad. I told them it wasn't actually the story